Well, on Tuesday night, Israeli forces carried out strikes on the southern city of Rafah, where more than 1.5 million displaced Palestinians have sought shelter. The army targeted a residential building, killing at least 8 people. Another 12 were injured. In central Gaza, an airstrike targeted the crowded Nuseirat Refugee camp, killing at least 12 Palestinians. Children are amongst those dead. People were left to dig through the rubble with their bare hands to try to find survivors. And the wounded were taken to nearby hospitals, which are already overwhelmed with patients and running out of basic medical supplies. Only a handful of health facilities are still functioning in Gaza, and only barely. Let's bring in Hani Mahmoud. He's live for us now in Rafah in southern Gaza. So, Hani, yet more deadly strikes on the residents of Gaza. Tell us about what happened overnight there.
Yes, we're almost a few hours after UN Security Council calling for a ceasefire failed to pass. The Israeli military intensified its aerial attacks and a ground invasion across the central area and the southern part of the Gaza Strip. In the central area, more residential homes being targeted and more public facilities completely destroyed or severely damaged in the overcrowded Nuseirat Refugee camp in the city of Deir al-Balah. That's very close to the only remaining operational hospital in the central area. But so far, we're looking at large number of people have been killed and other numbers of injuries who rushed to the hospital, and already overwhelmed, exhausted health facilities unable to treat these large numbers of injuries. In Khan Yunis, particularly the western part of the city, Al-Mawasi evacuation zone. It's important to point out to our viewer that this particular area was designated and described largely by the Israeli military for people to evacuate to because it is safe. It came under heavy bombardment, almost 30 tanks supported by bulldozer and heavy aerial coverage by attack drones, and taking over the coastal road, ordering people to evacuate from it one more time, targeting an area that is used by an international organization, Doctors Without Borders, causing further civilian casualties and level of destructions. In Rafah, a residential home was targeted. We're looking at 5 members of one family were killed inside their residential home in a massive airstrikes and overnight.
And, Hani, the World Food Programme has paused deliveries of food. Give us an idea of the impact that is having on already desperate people, especially in the north of Gaza.
Yes, well, the suspension came right after assessment made on the ground. So far, the ongoing bombings and the conditions it created on the ground just have been very difficult, or made it very difficult for international organizations, including the United Nations, different agencies, to deliver aid to the northern part. There is an actual famine going on. People are desperate for food, for basic necessities. If we look at the numbers of trucks that have been allowed to the northern part, just less than a trickle amount have been delivered. Just within the past 2 days, there was a video circulating on the internet showing how people were surrounding a truck filled with the flowers, bag of the flowers, and just thousands of people, literally thousands of people reaching to get a bag of flowers so they could sustain themselves. The situations in the northern part are very desperate, very dire condition. We're talking about 600,000 people at the risk of losing their life, at the risk because of famine and because of the ongoing starvation that is used by the Israeli military as a weapon to kill more people. So people are not only dying of the ongoing unpredictable bombs and the ground invasion, but now there is a risk of dying because of the ongoing famine that is caused by this war.
Yes, and Hani, as you're speaking there, we're watching pictures of people scooping flour out of the mud from burst bags and putting it in their pockets or anything they can carry to take it home. Hani Mahmoud bringing us the latest there in Gaza. Thank you. Well, let's turn now to the occupied West Bank, where an Israeli raid on the Jenin refugee camp has killed at least 1 Palestinian. Soldiers set fire to a car as they withdrew in the early hours of Wednesday. Israeli forces also stormed Askar refugee camp in the city of Nablus and raided towns near Tubas and Kalkia. Israel has increased the frequency and intensity of its raids since October the 7th. Zain Basravi joins us now from Nablus in the occupied West Bank. Zain, tell us about these latest raids there overnight.
Well, we've seen yet again another night of raids across the occupied West Bank, but what we saw in Jenin specifically is different, far more intense than raids we've seen in recent memory in these occupied territories. Israeli special forces conducting an 8 to 9 hour operation throughout the night to get to one man, a young Palestinian resistance fighter named Arif Kaddoumi, a man in his 20s suspected to have been behind the death of an Israeli soldier near Nablus last year in September. Now, the Israeli forces used airstrikes. They had dozens of men, armored vehicles on the ground to go after one house, to go after this one individual. Unconfirmed reports of Israeli injuries. Really, the intensity of this nighttime raid, specifically the one last night in Jenin, really does illustrate how much of a threat Israel's government, Israel's military sees these young armed fighters, people they consider terrorists, but in their communities. These young men who see picking up arms as the only solution to the ongoing occupation, resistance, armed resistance, the only solution to the daily problems of Israeli oppression that they face. For their communities, these men are considered not terrorists as the Israeli government would label them, but as leaders, as community organizers, as true freedom fighters. And simply seeing the intensity with which Israel carried out this campaign, we notice how much of a threat they represent. But when we go into these camps, and we've spoken to the people there, some of them who live in some of the worst circumstances, some of the worst humanitarian conditions, the ongoing rhetoric of defiance that comes from these people would suggest that it will be far easier for the Israeli government, for the military, to kill the man than it will be to kill the idea of resistance.
And Zain, with these raids happening daily in different parts across the occupied West Bank, how are people managing to cope with this continual disruption to their lives?
You're exactly right. Continued disruption. And it's not just in Jenin. We've seen it all over the occupied West Bank. We were just in Tulkarem just a few days ago when there was another raid that killed yet another armed fighter, a man in his 30s. We spoke to people there. And in Tulkarem, so far this year, refugee camps in the city of Tulkarem, not far from us here in Nablus, just about a 20-minute drive away, the Israeli military in these raids has destroyed more houses and buildings so far this year in Tulkarem than anywhere else in the occupied West Bank. Palestinians living there describe the government, the military raids there, routinely turning their streets into veritable war zones. And they worry. They know that what's happening in Gaza is far worse, but they feel they're getting a taste of it here in the occupied West Bank, and they worry that it could get worse in the coming future.
One of the patterns of Israel's decades-long occupation, a core component of psychological warfare being waged against Palestinians,